Well, hello everyone. It's wonderful to be able to spend this time again together, whatever time that may happen to be for you, depending on where and when in the world you're connecting. Today, my presentation is called Using Our Tools, and of course, that's from Chapter 9, or Day 9 of the Tao of Joy Every Day. And the subtitle that I've chosen for this presentation is Shaping Our Environment. And one of the things about the Tao that I find so wonderful is that the teachings and the practice of it really is, in a way, about shaping our environment in a positive way. If you employ the Ego and Tao teachings to the best of your ability, not right away, but slowly over time, you're able sort of to create a life of happiness and balance. And in a way, that can happen through shaping our environment. So I'm going to try to talk about some specifics about that. So let me go ahead and jump into it here. So I want to start by talking about a misconception that often pervades, that some people think that, you know, humans and their tools and their technology are somehow not part of the Tao, because the Tao is about nature, and therefore the way man uses his invention of tools and technology to, I'm going to say, some people are in the position that unnaturally shape the world is somehow un-Tao-like. But I have to be honest with you, I don't feel that way. And I'll try my best to explain why I don't feel that way. And to do that, I want to give an example. And this slide is, I've titled Tools and Technology, but underneath I've put Grunion versus man. And that may seem like an odd slide, but I'll do my best to try to explain. So the grunion is a kind of fish. I believe it's indigenous strictly to California. I might be wrong about that, but I think that is actually true. And I'll get into the grunion in a moment. And of course, versus man, and the depiction for man I've shown there is the late great Jacob Bronowski, who was a scientist and mathematician and poet. And I've chosen him specifically as our representation for man, and by man I mean both woman and man. I mean the species of man generally, even though I guess I could have said grunion versus person, but I didn't. But this reference here I'm making, grunion versus man, is actually right out of a production that was made by the BBC in the late 60s entitled The Ascent of Man. And Bronowski was the star of that production. And basically, the production involves Bronowski going around the world with the camera crew. They turn on the camera. They show various scenes, and Bronowski basically just starts talking. Now, there are some special effects in it. However, it was aired on PBS in the early 70s, and so the special effects were primitive by today's standards. Particularly when you look at the computer simulations, you'll find them quite funny. It reminds me of watching Star Trek and watching the Enterprise being pulled along by a little fishing string. They're primitive. But I have to say, Jacob Bronowski's The Ascent of Man is a brilliant miniseries. It's 13 parts. It's 13 hours long. But I have to say it is absolutely riveting to listen to a man like Bronowski speak about the things that he speaks about. Not to take away from Cosmos, both versions, the Carl Sagan's version of the 80s and the more recent one with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Those are wonderful pieces, or series as well. And they, particularly the most recent Cosmos, brings all the special effects tools to bear on the exposition of what's expressed in that series, Cosmos. And by contrast, The Ascent of Man doesn't really have that. It's very dated. And yet, I have to say, between the three of them, the original cosmos, the new cosmos, and the ascent of man. The ascent of man is actually my favorite. And if you've never seen it, I encourage you to seek it out. Now, Bernowski opens the first episode, which is entitled Lower Than the Angels. And he opens by talking about the California fish, the grunion. And he talks about how Native Americans observed that during the moonlight, there was a fish that came upon the shore and danced. And what was happening there was that the grunion washes ashore on the high tide as part of its mating ritual. And the females will bury themselves in the sand tail first, and then the male of the species will come and gyrate or dance around them, thus fertilizing the eggs as they hatch. Now, the full moon is important because it gives 9 or 10 days between the high tides, and in that time, these fertilized eggs gestate and hatch, and then the high tide returns and washes them out to sea. And what Bernowski points out is that this is an example of how the animal kingdom adapts to its environment. And he points out that in landscapes all around the world, you'll see different kinds of animals adapting to their environment. And to a certain extent, this is true of man too, because just like the grunion, we have also had a biological evolution that has allowed us to adapt in a way to life here on Earth. But what Bernowski points out is that man also has another kind of evolution, and that evolution is cultural. Now, can animals have culture? Well, as a matter of fact, yes, they can. I'll give you an example. There are monkeys certain tribes of monkeys, if they live in an environment with a lot of twigs that are present, they'll use those twigs to open a nut and eat it. Another tribe of monkeys that lives in a different environment where rocks are abundant might use those rocks to achieve the same effect, open the nut and obtain the treat inside. But what's interesting is if you take the monkeys that use stones and you put them in an environment that's mainly twigs but has a few stones, those monkeys will continue to use stones to open the nuts. And similarly, if you put the ones that are used to using twigs to open the nuts in an environment where it's mostly stones but there's some twigs, those monkeys will continue to use twigs. Now, believe it or not, that's culture. It's a primitive culture. It's not evolved the way man's culture has evolved, but undoubtedly man's cultural evolution started likely very simply as well. And so what Bernowski points out is that because of man's cultural evolution, he doesn't only adapt to his environment biologically, but he shapes his environment to suit his own needs. And it's really through the development over the centuries of man's tools and technology that allow him to do that. And that really is what the 13-part series, The Ascent of Man, is about. It's about our cultural evolution over time. And as I've said, it's absolutely riveting. But the reason why I'm bringing all this up is to submit to you that man's cultural evolution, in my view, does not set him apart from nature. Man is still a part of nature, and his cultural evolution is a part of nature too, I believe. And so I don't think there's anything undao-like about using all that nature has to offer, its tools and its technology, to improve our lives or to make our lives richer. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. So I want to get into some specifics about tools, if I can. So in a way, tools are an extension of our senses. And what I have here is two examples of that. One is the telescope, the other is the microscope. Now, these particular tools extend the sense of our vision. The telescope allows us to peer out into the universe and to observe things that help us understand the universe we live in an interesting and wonderful way. And then the opposite of that, of course, is the microscope, which takes our vision down to the very small, allows us to observe things at a very small level and to gain understanding of our world on the micro level. So tools are an interesting thing that man has managed to develop that helps him understand his world and make it rich and interesting. Now, our history of extending our senses and what it does for us is a fascinating one. And of course, I'm using the example of how, these particular tools are extensions of vision, but there's other extensions. I mean, a stethoscope might be an example of extension of our hearing, or a recording device would be an example of an extension of our hearing. But that's one of the interesting things about tools is they extend our senses and allow us to see things in a way that animals who don't have the ability to use tools, create and use tools the way we do, just do not have. So in addition to physical tools like the microscope or the telescope or even a hammer and a drill and or things like that, there are other kinds of tools as well. I'm just going to call them mental tools. And I have here a pictorial representation of mathematics, specifically Euclidean mathematics, with its triangles and circles and squares and cubes. And mathematics is also a fascinating tool. It's not a physical tool. I consider it a mental tool, but one that also helps us understand our world in a way that we couldn't if we hadn't either discovered or created it. I don't know. Did we create mathematics or did we discover it? Hard to say. But at any rate, it is amazing how well mathematics works to describe our world. It's uncanny, really. And of course, there's another kind of mathematics besides Euclidean mathematics as well. And this picture here is a picture of a mathematician named Benoit Mandelbrot, who is famous for the Mandelbrot set, which has a lot to do with fractal geometry, another form of mathematics, and another interesting mental tool that helps us recognize patterns in nature. If you're interested in that at all, a couple of years before Benoit Mandelbrot died, Nova did a special called Hunting the Hidden Dimension, and it was about the Mandelbrot set, and Mandelbrot is actually in the program. It's quite fascinating. And if you're interested in that, I invite you to seek that out as well. But my main point of bringing these two things up is just to explain that tools don't necessarily have to be physical. There can be mental tools as well. Another mental tool that may be, for most people, maybe more practical than mathematics day to day, I would say is the mental tool of persuasion. I can tell you that in my personal career, I use persuasion almost every day. And if you are interested in persuasion, or I invite you to investigate a book called Influence by Dr. Robert Cialdini. It's called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. It's a fascinating book. I honestly think that it's something that everyone should read, if for no other reason than to be able to recognize when persuasion is being used on you. Because persuasion, like all tools, whether mental or physical, is actually a neutral tool. Tools are neutral. They're not good or bad in and of themselves. It's how they're used that often determines whether they're good or bad. And persuasion is an interesting mental tool and a helpful one. And it's very powerful, but with great power has to come great responsibility. I'm going to take a little time here. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to take a little time to just sort of expand on persuasion a little bit, if I can. So, Cialdini opens the book by talking about someone who contacted him and explained an odd situation that happened. The woman who contacted him was a business owner, and she had attained some turquoise jewelry at a good price and was looking to sell it. And she had a store, a jewelry store, and she advertised it and put it in a prominent location of the store and did all the marketing techniques that you use to prominently feature a product. And it was what we call in the business world a dog. It just wouldn't sell. And so finally, after trying lots of things and it not selling, she decided, well, it's time to cut my losses. So she instructed one of her employees to mark it down by half, and she took off for the weekend, hoping that, marking it down, because if you mark something down low enough, generally, you find that magic price and it'll sell. Well, an interesting thing happened. The employee misunderstood her instructions, and instead of marking it down by half, she doubled the price. Now, much to this business owner's surprise, when she came back from her weekend vacation, she discovered what the employee had done, but an interesting thing happened. All of the jewelry sold. And so she contacted social scientist Robert Cialdini, and she said, what happened? And Cialdini had an idea of what happened. And he then goes on to use an example from the animal kingdom, which I'm just going to briefly talk about. And that has to do with turkeys. So turkeys, as it turns out, mother turkeys specifically, are quite good mothers. They're very good at raising their young. They're nurturing, they're loving. They help their young offspring grow and develop. But it turns out that baby turkeys make a distinct sound that goes something like cheep, 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 cheep. And if there's a baby turkey that doesn't make that sound, that cheep, cheep, cheep sound, the mother turkey will often ignore it or sometimes even kill it. This is obviously a part of the turkey's repertoire, what it does, its instincts. But social scientists observing this did something interesting. They took a stuffed polecat, which is the turkey's natural predator, and they put it in with the mother turkey and her young offspring. And to no surprise, the mother turkey attacks the stuffed polecat and rips it to shreds. Now that's no surprise, right? We know that animals usually will fiercely protect their young, and a mother turkey will probably fight to the death against its natural predator to protect its young and allow its species to continue to propagate. But then the social scientists did an interesting thing. They took another stuffed polecat, but this time they put a tape recorder inside it. And the tape recording made a sound of cheep, cheep, cheep. And what do you think the turkey does? Well, mother turkey doesn't do anything. And what the social scientists have done there is they've teased out a subroutine at the wrong time in the turkey's repertoire. Now, Robert Cialdini calls this kind of thing click-whir. Now, if you think that humans aren't subject to click-whir, I invite you to read the book Influence, because it turns out often we're also, like that turkey, subject to click-whir. And really, that's what the book is about. Robert Cialdini expands on all of the tools of persuasion and how we can be subject to them. And the main reason why I wanted to bring it up is because it segues nicely into my next slide, which is the misuse of tools. So as I said earlier, it's not that tools are bad or good. Tools are essentially neutral, and that's true whether they're physical tools or mental tools like persuasion. But with great power comes great responsibility. And you have to be careful using a tool like psychology. I'm sorry, like persuasion. Now, I use it every day in my career, but I'll honestly tell you that I use it with the goal of making people happy and satisfied. That's how I use it. Now, there are plenty of ways that it's used for other means and purposes. And one of the things that I'm aware of from having studied it but won't use is fear. You can certainly use fear to get people to persuade people to do things. I personally consider it unethical to do that and won't do it. But it's a good thing to study and learn about, because if for no other reason, it allows you to recognize when it's being done to you. And I'll be honest with you, click word is powerful. Sometimes, even when I know what's being done to me, it doesn't stop me from being affected by the persuasion techniques. But at least it gives you a fighting chance. So definitely an interesting book to check out. The other example on the misuse of tools that I want to talk about is the cell phone. When it comes to tools and technology, the cell phone, I think, is the current best example of tools and technology. It's an amazing thing that we have access to all human knowledge in our pockets, that we have access to literally endless entertainment in our pockets. There's plenty of good things about that. There's nothing wrong with entertainment and moderation. There's nothing wrong with knowledge. However, let me just say that if you misuse it by getting too wrapped in the warm glow of that cell phone at the expense of missing out on time with the warm glow that's created from spending time with people you love, then you might be misusing that tool. And that's something to be aware of with technology. I mean, yes, technology and tools can have their problems, but the problems aren't the tools themselves. It's our misuse of the tools. It's our misuse that's un-Tao-like, not the tools or technology themselves. There's nothing wrong with embracing tools and technology to make your life rich, full, happy, and balanced. Okay, so I'm going to try to start to sum it up now, if I can. So one, a common misconception about the Tao is that it is all about nature and therefore opposed to technology. The truth is that human beings and our technology are a part of nature and not set apart from it. I think this is very true. There's nothing wrong with our tools and technology. They don't separate us from nature. Our development of them, our cultural evolution that created them, is as much a part of nature as our biological evolution was. And there's nothing un-Tao-like about developing, using tools, and using them to invoke our creative powers. You know, it is an interesting thing about, I've heard this idea put forward, I think it has a lot of merit, that men love to build things. We love to, you usually find guys who love to do carpentry, they love to create things, and maybe more so than women might. And I've heard of the idea put forth, and I think it has I think it's very valid, this idea. The reason why men tend to do that is because, unlike women, we don't play any role in creation, really. I mean, yes, we contribute our 23 chromosomes to the offspring, but it's the mother who grows that baby, who gives birth to it. And that's biological creation right there. And, you know, physically, men are not equipped to do that. And it's argued that our need to create is maybe what gives us a leaning to be more likely to be interested in carpentry and things like that. Not to say that women can't be, of course they can. Okay, 2. While it is true that there are real problems with civilization and technology, the problems stem from the misuse of tools rather than from the tools themselves. The tools are essentially neutral. It is what we choose to do with them that gives rise to positive or negative results. So, an example, you know, Here's a real cliche example, but I'll throw it in here shamelessly nonetheless. You take an axe. If you use an axe to cut down a tree and make firewood and burn it to create warmth in your home, well, that's a good use of an axe. If you use an axe to kill the neighbor that annoys you, well, that's a misuse of the tool. Okay, so, but mental tool is true. The same thing is true. It's something like, as I talked about, the tools of the mental tool of the psychology of persuasion. You can use that for good or for things that aren't so good. The tool itself is neutral, but how you use it determines whether you get positive or negative results that are in line with your moral code. Okay, so a skillful Tao cultivator will embrace all that nature offers, including our ability to think and use tools to shape our environment in a positive way. Taking this approach enables us humans to use tools to help us tap into our creative abilities. That is the Tao at work in our lives. Okay, so I want to end the presentation with the Tao of Joy Every Day, a great book to use daily to help one study and learn the Tao teachings and put them into action. Okay, so there it was, using our tools, day 9, shaping our environment. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I hope I was able to say something that was of use, and I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday.
Alex, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. A couple of points that I wanted to raise. First of all, thank you for the recommendation on the ascent of man, as well as the book, Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about these two. I find them absolutely fascinating. Can you talk about the content of these two?
Yes, I'm happy to. I'm happy to do that. Let me start briefly with the ascent of man. It really is, gosh, one of my favorite things. I find it both entertaining and fascinating. The things that are covered by Bronowski in that series are amazing. I mean, it's all about how, you know, someone started, you know, by banging two stones together and broke one and accidentally created a sharp edge. And that simple tool, you could argue, has a direct line to everything that came after, from the invention of the plow, which, you know, as the old saying goes, give me a lever long enough, I can move the earth. Well, that's a reference to the plow and agriculture, which is when civilization went from being nomadic to being more sedentary, being in place. The development of metal alloys and the discovery of chemistry and other things. There's a whole series on, one of the episodes is dedicated to Newton and his discoveries. There's one of the episodes is on Galileo. One of the episodes is on genetics. That's absolutely riveting and fascinating. If you ever want to know about human culture, both biological and, human evolution, both biologically, our biological evolution and our cultural evolution, I can't think of a better series to recommend. It is absolutely fascinating. It's historically accurate. And even though it's old, even though it's dated material, I mean, it's from more than, 40 years ago, I think now. And Bronowski, of course, died a couple of years after it aired. But it is just an amazing exploration into man and his evolution. Just absolutely fascinating. Now, with regard to the other recommendation I made, which is the book Influence, I can expand on that a little bit. I can give you some specifics of how persuasion works, and maybe I'll do that in this way. Have you ever been to Costco and partaken of a free sample and ended up buying something that you didn't necessarily want to buy? Well, that's probably because a lot of click war was going on. One of the things about giving a free sample that companies do is they're invoking a persuasive rule of reciprocity. By giving you that free sample, subconsciously, you're going to feel inclined to reciprocate. And for the company, they're hoping you reciprocate by buying whatever their product is. So that isn't, giving the free gift is an example of how persuasion is used. And at Costco, that's usually the opening line, right, is the free sample. There are other things too, and I'll stick with this example. So, in fact, I don't know if he specifically mentions Costco, but one of the examples Cialdini gives in the book is that there's a woman who reads his book and says, "Hey, this is what happened to me. I went well, I'll just say it was Costco. I don't know if it was or not. And she got a free sample of a beverage that she really liked, and she tasted it, and she recognized that, hey, this is the reciprocity persuasion trick being used here. But she tasted it and liked it. And then the next thing that the salesperson offered was they actually asked if she wanted to buy it. And, you know, you could buy 4 containers for, let's say, $50. And the person said, no, I don't want to do that. And then they invoked what's the second rule, which is the concession offer. Well, how about buying just one for $10? Now, the second offer is harder to resist than the first offer. And again, it's click word that's going on. And one of the ways that Cialdini explains this, he explains it in the context of Watergate, which is one of my favorite subjects from history. One kind of wonders how a guy as smart as Nixon and the people that he employed in his administration, who were also quite smart, how they ever agreed to something as ridiculous as breaking into Daniel Ellsberg's office or breaking into the Democratic National Anti-Court. How did they ever agree to that? And Jeb Magruder, who, you know, was involved in hearing the original plan from G. Gordon Liddy, very candidly said, how could we have been so stupid? And the point that Cialdini makes is that when G. Gordon Liddy first came up with his ideas, they were even crazier than the break-ins. You know, his first 2 things were absolutely nuts, and both the former Attorney General, John Mitchell, and Jeb Magruder were able to say no to that. But by the third offer came around, somehow they signed off on it. And what Cialdini points out is this concession, the second or third offer, the fact that they said yes to that was set up by the ridiculousness of the first ask. And this is an example of click word. So going back to my Costco example, that's the other thing. Now, the last tactic that might be used if you resist that, you know about the second concession offer and you're able to resist that. This is where fear might be employed. And you say, well, how are you going to use fear to get someone to buy a drink? Well, it has to do with using the technique of scarcity. So the Costco representative might say, hey, you know, I'm only going to be here for 2 more days throughout the weekend. And then after that, you know, I might not be back for months. You may not have the opportunity to buy this product. And that's an example of fear and scarcity. And the person who read Cialdini's book and knew of all these techniques, including the scarcity technique of persuasion, ended up falling for it and bought the item, took it home, and sure enough, it didn't taste as good as it did in the store. So basically, the book is Cialdini explaining things like this, and he explains it much better than I've explained it, and in much greater detail. And he's a brilliant social scientist. But persuasion is an interesting thing. In fact, just to sort of tell you, I'll give a political example. I know when President Trump won the election, a lot of people were surprised. But I'll tell you, people who are familiar with the techniques of persuasion weren't as surprised that he won. That's because Trump, his use of persuasion was picture perfect, to be honest with you. Now, I'm not saying whether I subscribe to Trump or not. I'll leave that off. But what I will tell you is he's the most persuasive politician I've ever seen. And
well, you know,
yes,
the cartoonist, Scott Adams, have written quite a bit about that, about the persuasion techniques, and he received a lot of vitriol for expressing those views.
Yes, he practically ruined his speaking career, which was very lucrative, by doing that. Yeah, and he talks about that in his book. The book you're referring to is Win Bigly. I think it's called How to Win Big in a World Where Facts Don't Matter. And it's one of the interesting things about persuasion. Facts and logic and reason have nothing to do with persuasion. Mr. Spock would not have made a good salesman because his logic and reason would have gotten him nowhere.
And also, just a quick question: when you hear things about limited time offer, is that similar to the scarcity technique, or is that a different category altogether?
No, I think it's very similar. And the important way to think about it to guard yourself against the scarcity rule is to remember that, you know, if they try to tell you, hey, buy this cookie because it's not going to be around for very much longer. The reality of it is that whether you buy it or not, the cookie's going to taste what the cookie tastes like. The fact that it's scarce doesn't make the cookie taste any better. And it's important to reframe it in your own mind that way so you don't fall victim to scarcity. By the way, the great example that Cialdini gives on the scarcity principle in persuasion is he talks about how his brother worked his way through college, and it's absolutely fascinating. What his brother did was he would acquire cars, and he had some knowledge. He knew how to fix them up, at least superficially. And then he would look up the high-end value on the Kelley Blue Book, and his brother was very good at writing persuasive ads and getting people to be interested in the car. And so, you know, if you could write a good enough persuasive ad, maybe 3 or 4 people would call and say, hey, I want to see the car. And then what he did was he would basically schedule all 4 of the prospects who might buy the car at the same time of day at the same time. And so invariably the first person would come and would look at the car and, you know, try to work in negotiating the best price. And right about that time, as they were settling into doing that, the second person would show up. And in doing this, it invokes the idea of scarcity, because he would go, excuse me for a second, and he'd go up to the second person. He goes, hey, this guy was here first, so I'm going to let him, you know, look at the car and decide whether or not he wants it or not. And if he doesn't, well, then, you know, I'll let you know. So do you mind waiting over there for a moment? And doing that, it caused the idea of scarcity to be invoked. Like, there's only one car here, and now 2 people are competing for it. You know, I might lose out if I don't buy the car. That's click word going on. And again, you know, you could argue the ethics of something like that, but it definitely works.
Indeed. Well, you know, I have a feeling that I need to become more familiar with the techniques of persuasion myself. You know, I think I can use a lot of help in that category.
Yes, you know, also too, I just talked about a lot about the negative aspects of persuasion, but let me say there are positive ones as well. I use persuasion on my kids a lot to get them to do things like brushing their teeth and going to bed on time and doing their homework, because it's in their best interest. And kids, believe it or not, are as subject to click word as adults are. And so when you employ a tool like persuasion with the good intent, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But you do have to be careful because it can be abused. Yeah.
That was also, by the way, fascinating when you talked about the turkeys, the sounds they made. It's a bit of a coincidence because it's the year of the dog, and I was actually going to talk a little bit about the sounds that dogs make. And I think everyone will see a connection there, as well as gain some insights into Chinese culture.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, it's funny how synergy develops in these meetings. You know, often what Bill says when he goes first, like usual, often he talks about things that I'm planning to bring up in a slightly different way. It's funny how it all comes together, and I guess it's just that the way the Tao works. And I know we can't prove it in any empirical way. I think it is a matter of faith, but it is interesting, the pieces of evidence we get of how the synergy of the Tao works.